possibility of accidents, so they need to be supervised at all times. Thanks very much. So the minister has arrived. He reminds me of the story when Michael Collins arrived to Dublin Castle, and the viceroy said to him, he said, "Mr. Collins," he said, "you were 2 minutes late." And he said, after 800 years, you are welcome to your 2 minutes. But to be fair to the minister, he was on business in town this morning, delighted that he could engage with the Chamber of Tourism, and that's a really important step this morning. More importantly, he's promised me he's not going to talk about yesterday, and in sympathy, I noticed he's wearing a red tie. So thanks very much, Minister. So, Reverend Fathers, Mayor, Minister O'Donovan, elected representatives, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Kinsale Commemorations Committee, you are welcome to our special event marking the 100th anniversary of the handing over of the town's military barracks to the Irish state 100 years ago. While the actual event took place in February 1922, we decided to mark the anniversary on today's date due to the uncertainty around COVID restrictions at the time. In planning the commemoration today, we would not have been able to proceed without the significant backing of the community. Included in that long line of supporters are the OPW, Evelyn and the staff at Charlesfort, Cork County Council, the Commemoration Committee at County Hall, the Heritage Officer, Conor Nelligan. Can I just say, Conor Nelligan is here. He does more for heritage in this county than anybody else. He's the most unassuming man. He's probably hiding in a corner today, and I just want to acknowledge him. Conor, thank you for all your efforts. Councillor Marie O'Sullivan, the Department of Defence, Sergeant Dennis McGarry at the Military Museum Collins's Barracks, the staff at Cork County Council Kinsale, Kinsale Harbour Cruise, Tony Lane, the White House, Kinsale, not the one in America, Jim Edwards, Fitzgerald and Associate, Ross Kennedy, the Lord's Own, the Enniscorthy Historical Reenactment Society, Timmy O'Donovan, the Harbour Master, Rose Cagney, Bree Carney, the Coast Guards, the Stewards, Pat O'Leary, Acton's Hotel, the Temperance Hall Committee, Kinsale Garda, the Reverend Rutherford, Father Stan, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hurley, Lieutenant McGuigan, Sergeant Murray, Kinsale Gardaí, students from Kinsale Community School and Ballinspittle, Kinsale Soccer Club, Dan Lane the Piper, and if I've forgotten anyone, apologies. So we would especially like to thank today the County Mayor, Gillian Tolan. She has backed our efforts unwaveringly since we first approached her, and I would like to express the committee's deep appreciation for her support. As Chairman of Kinsale Commemoration Committee, I am deeply grateful to the sterling work of my committee members. Their commitment to this project has been outstanding, working tirelessly to ensure its success. It's an honour to be associated with them. Shannon Ford has proven invaluable, as well as Fergal Brown, who unfortunately can't be with us today. Our man in the castle, Padraig Walsh, is a rock of sense, and Diarmuid O'Donovan's experience we could not do without, while Terry Connolly is a recent member, keeping a close eye on all things financial. Easter is a date associated with the birth of the Irish state. We in this country value our democracy and our freedom that was born out of the events 100 years ago. Today, our friends in the Ukraine are fighting for those same values, and I think it is fitting we should show our support with a round of applause in solidarity. So we will begin now with our commemoration with the Foggy Tune. So can I have the members from Kinsale Community School, the singers and the musicians, if you can make your way over here. historian, has loads of promise. She wrote a book called Don't Forget Me Now. It's about the War of Independence in Kinsale and all those forgotten people who made such a contribution to our independence. The title was based on her grandmother, who had played a huge part around Dundero and in the Shannon in the War of Independence. And like a lot of them, they were forced to it was, pensions, and trying to get pensions was a struggle. And in her last letter, she said, "Don't forget me now." And Shannon chose it as the title for her book. So what Shannon is going to do is she's going to tell us about what happened when the British finally vacated the fort at Kinsale and the Irish Army came in and took over the control of the fort. Thanks, Shannon.
Kinsale had been home to a military garrison for centuries, and since the 17th century you had fortifications like this one behind us, Charles Fort in Kinsale, and also Kinsale military barracks, and so Kinsale could be home to up to 1,000 soldiers. So over the years then, as you would expect, Kinsale, the local people of Kinsale became very much intertwined with the local military, and by the War of Independence then you had a lot of people with family links to the military, and also it's how a lot of people did their business and how they got by. So as you can imagine then, in terms of removing British rule from Ireland, a lot of people weren't too keen on that and they would have rather maintained the status quo. But also in Kinsale you did have a number of people who were men and women who were pledged to an independent Ireland, and they put themselves in very challenging situations, ostracising themselves from a lot of their local community in order to achieve that independence. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was the result of that very hard-fought War of Independence. However, it wasn't the result that everyone had hoped for. The terms of the treaty featured a number of compromises. Ultimately, it didn't achieve the long-wanted republic, and also there still had to be an oath of allegiance to the British monarch, as well as a confirmation of division of Ireland, north and south. But one of the most significant outcomes of the treaty was that would be the withdrawal of British troops from most of Southern Ireland. I say most because they did hold on to places like Spike Island, among others. The news of the military garrison being removed to Kinsale would have been received by some people with absolute jubilation and excitement, and from others a real fear and uncertainty as to what would happen when they lost all these soldiers from here. So it's important to acknowledge then that the organisation of the British withdrawal in Ireland was ultimately it was pretty unprecedented, and for that reason things were a bit up in the air as this was all happening from about January of 1922. The film Michael Collins by Neil Jordan would have us believe that it was a very ceremonial affair, but the reality in fact was quite different. And when I say this, I'm not trying to be smart in any way, but the British military were far more used to being in the position of taking over places rather than giving them back. And from the Irish perspective, this was all completely new to them too. So it was very much uncharted territory, and many of these handover formalities were very much up in the air until the last minute. And the power struggle between British officers and the IRA in these handovers is also very evident. For example, at the handover in Bandon, which featured a lot of the same IRA and provisional government representatives that took over Kinsale, the Irish delegation had quite a few issues with the infamous Major Percival as they tried to take over Bandon. Todd Andrews, who was a representative from the provisional Irish government, wrote that Major Percival objected to any of the local IRA being taken on to assist on the grounds that they were not covered by my credentials. I told him that unless the three men I had selected were allowed to assist me in checking the inventories, I would refuse to take over the barrack. He realised I was prepared to create a scene as a matter of principle, so after much hesitation and a prolonged conversation with his fellow officers, my proposal was agreed to. So I think that really highlights the frustration of a lot of these British soldiers regarding the circumstances of their departure and their attempts to demonstrate some control or authority over the situation still, because they viewed the IRA and the provisional government as essentially a rabble army. They didn't view them as equals, so there's a very clear power struggle there. And then the somewhat chaotic nature of the evacuation of the British military can be seen in the plans that were made for Kinsale too. So it had been anticipated that they would be evacuated from Kinsale by the 10th of February 1920. Members of the West Yorkshire Regiment, who had been based in Kinsale, were the first to leave, but they departed by the 9th of February. However, the departure of the Essex Regiment was quite delayed. But meanwhile, the handover of Kinsale RIC barracks took place on the 11th of February with 11 RIC departing and a number of IRA men moving in. So the RIC barracks in Kinsale was located in the town car park in the centre of town, kind of across from Centra. So I'm going to be using quite a few quotes here. This one I'm going to use is from Corporal A.E. Cooper of the Essex Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment. He was based in Kinsale military barracks, and he was a quartermaster. He kept quite a detailed diary, and he wrote about the handover of the RIC barracks. The police barracks in town were taken over by the IRA on Sunday, February 11th, and when I visited the town on Monday the 13th, the green, white and gold tricolour was operating from a flagstaff, newly erected on the roof of the building. The gates were closed, and inside the courtyard, members of the new force were pacing up and down. The sentry was dressed in ordinary civilian clothes common to the district, with the exception of leather leggings and polished boots. He was equipped with a leather bandolier and leather waist belt and carried his rifle at his slope. So, after much delay then, the formal handover proceedings between the Essex Regiment and the Irish Provisional Government took place on Sunday the 19th of February 1922. So those leading the Irish delegation were Todd Andrews, who had been active in Dublin during the War of Independence, and he was sent to Cork to represent the Irish Provisional Government in handover proceedings. He was 21 years old. Commandant of the 3rd Cork Brigade, Sean Lehan, who had just turned 25, he was leading the IRA delegation. Also Brigade Adjutant Sean McCarthy, who was from Upton, he was 33, and he later served as Lord Mayor of Cork 5 times and also a TD. And then Michael O'Donoghue, who was an Assistant Brigade Engineer, and he was 21. So you can see this is a major responsibility for these men, and you can see how young they were. So I just wanted to point out then, so the IRA established their HQ in the commercial hotel in Kinsale, which we would now know as Oscar Madison's. And this hotel was run by the Fitzgerald women, who had been crucial members of Kinsale coming to man. But sometimes we might think that these people who were involved in the Irish War of Independence were, involved in this war, but they had nothing else going on around it. But just to kind of give you the kind of human stories of this, Sean Lehan and Kit Fitzgerald, one of the ladies in the commercial hotel, love was blooming, and they eventually got married a few years later. So then, to give an insight into the scenes in Kinsale Barracks on the 19th of February 1922, Corporal A.E. Cooper of the Essex Regiment wrote in his diary, "The representatives of the Provisional Government arrived at Kinsale Barracks on the morning of Sunday the 19th of February. They were all typical Irishmen, dressed in the style common to the South, wearing invariably leggings, waterproof raincoats and felt hats with turned-down brims. They immediately began to make an inspection of the barracks, being allowed to go wherever they wished, none of the troops interfering with them. The morning was one of those so common in Kinsale in winter, a strong westerly wind blowing with driving rain. The barracks on the Sunday morning presented the busiest appearance they had ever known." Now we also have an account of the handover formalities from the Irish perspective, written by Michael O'Donoghue, who was the Assistant Brigade Engineer. So some of this is printed in the commemorative booklet if you have one. So I'm just going to read some of that out there too. He wrote, "I well remember the morning we arrived at the very top of the steep barrack hill outside the main barrack gate. We had come on time by arrangement. Nevertheless, we were closely scrutinised and checked for our authority before being admitted. Once inside, we separated into 3 sections. Each section was accompanied by a light group of British officers. I was joined by a Royal Engineers officer in uniform, a captain and the clerk of works, a middle-aged civilian, as we began the job of inspecting the fixtures in each building, noting their condition and serviceability and listing all in a written report. The first barrack room's dormitory which we entered was almost full of Tommies, polishing, cleaning, shaving, dressing, etc., and our entry was greeted with jeers and boos, catcalls and loud and foul epithets of abuse. I was amazed at their coarse display of hostility, more amazed at their indiscipline and rowdy behaviour in the presence of their own military officer, a captain at that. The civilian clerk of works was nervous and ill at ease too. He whispered to me, 'We'll get out of here quickly. I don't like the look of these.' I won't say that word because there's some children here. All through that day of inspection in Kinsale Barracks, I kept close to my British officer escort. In contrast to the Tommies, the officers of the Essex Regiment whom we encountered in the barracks treated us with frigid politeness or ignored us altogether. Later, our joint inspections were finished, we adjourned to the office of Colonel Faber, the commanding officer of the Royal Engineers in Munster, in the officers' quarters in Kinsale Barracks. We checked over the complete list of fixtures inspected. Colonel Faber signed the handing over document on behalf of His Majesty's George V's government. I, Michael Vincent O'Donoghue, signed on behalf of the Provisional Government of Ireland that I had inspected the aforesaid list of fixtures fears that the British military would occupy Kinsale. In his diary, Colonel Cooper of the Essex Regiment detailed the final hours before departure in Kinsale Barracks. On the Monday, everyone was astir early and kits were packed and blankets rolled up in bundles. All kit boys and blankets were stacked outside the company barrack rooms before breakfast. During the morning and early afternoon, the work of conveying the remainder of the battalion baggage to the station was completed at 3 p.m. A convoy consisting all of the motor transport vehicles left the barracks for Cork. At 4:30 p.m, the Union Jack was handed down for the last time by the Butler Guard. After tea, there being no further work to be done, we all sat around the fire and the sergeant met and told yarns broken by an interval at supper. The night was of the wildest, a strong westerly gale blowing, with torrents of rain and easy blackness, only broken by vivid flashes of lightning and the old head, with flashbacks of distant strangers in flags. I don't relate to that one too. The company was called to attention by Commander Major Paddington, who just recently joined. This was accordingly done at the causing of quite quick march to Westfield. The troops passed out of the barracks underneath the old archway and out of the barricade. So, I'm also just going to read a small bit from Brigadier Frederick Clark of B Company Essex Regiment, who was based here in Charlesfort. And the begrudging feelings of the Essex Regiment about their departure is very clear from his account. So he wrote, "How we hated the idea of giving this fine old fort, which had the arms of Queen Elizabeth carved in stone on the front wall of the officers' quarters. We tried to get it out of the wall, but found that it had been carved on a huge block of stone which we were unable to move. Every officer and other rank felt angry and as we marched out of the dark from the fort, which had been held by British troops for about 350 years. We did not see the rabble waiting somewhere nearby to take over the fort, which they never would have captured, but which our politicians had given to them." So interestingly then, both sides feared that the other would make some attempts to attack the other on their departure, but ultimately nothing happened. So Michael O'Donoghue, Assistant Brigade Engineer for the Cork Brigade, wrote, "After all, nothing happened. The entire British garrison slipped away without incident and their special trains in the depth of the night. When day dawned, Kinsale Barracks was empty and desolate. That afternoon, the IRA party went in, posted guards and occupied the place. The IRA officers in Kinsale and district moved in too, and were fought in their headquarters." So just like that, centuries of British occupation in Kinsale was no more. The looming symbols of military might of the British Empire were now in the hands of the Irish. We might imagine scenes in Kinsale around this time. For many, it was celebration and relief and triumph, and for many others, it was the fear. The pro-British population would have felt very abandoned and fearful of what was to come. And they weren't wrong to be afraid. For the withdrawal of so many troops from Kinsale, with it came a serious economic slump. And without a place in the Empire, the fishing industry too found it difficult. In the barracks, the novelty of finally possessing these military structures quickly wore thin. Michael O'Donoghue recorded that they found barrack life drab, cold and unpleasant compared to the warm society and hospitality which we experienced while having no fixed abode, but moving from village to village in the homes of the people of West Cork. Moreover, tensions and disagreements were increasing over the treaty. A split in the once united nationalist movement and anti-treaty led to pro-treaty and anti-treaty supporters, with the outbreak of civil war from June 1922. I'm not going to go into detail about that tumultuous period, but it's worth noting that after just within a few months of the outbreak of those civil hostilities, a series of burnings in Kinsale had destroyed Kinsale Barracks, Charlesfort, Coast Guard stations, the RAC Barracks, assembly rooms and other buildings. It's not for me to stand here with the glorious benefit of hindsight to state whether or not it was the right thing to do to destroy these structures, but in many ways you have to try and relate to the mindset of the people who did. They would have felt they had no choice but to destroy them. Obviously they saw it symbolically in terms of this meant that the British could not come back and reoccupy, but also in the more immediate term with the civil war that was going on, it meant that the Free State forces could not occupy these places. So the Civil War is a very heartbreaking follow-up to the Irish War of Independence, and it took decades for Kinsale to heal. Kinsale had to reinvent itself and find a new way to survive, and this process was very slow, even to the point that in 1940 it was remarked that independence had been a good thing for Ireland, but a bad thing for Kinsale. However, thanks to many pioneering and forward-thinking individuals, Kinsale re-emerged in the 20th century as a leading tourist destination known for its rich heritage, scenery, and more recently a gourmet capital. Indeed, the old military barracks handed over to the Irish 100 years ago has become a site of industry and is now the home of Lidl and businesses like the Canvas Works and La Beauty Candles. Charles Fort was left in ruins for a decade, but in 1973 had been declared a national monument and is now in the care of the Office of Public Works. Charles Fort is now a leading heritage centre in Ireland and welcomes over 100,000 people every year. I've worked in the fort and I would like to think that my ancestors who fought in the Irish War of Independence would be quite amused at their great-granddaughter in East raising the Irish flag over the old Fort British fortification. Because thanks to the sacrifices they made 100 years ago, this place is now ours, and it's ours to enjoy however we please. And because 100 years ago the sacrifices they made ensured that their great-granddaughter would have the privilege of growing up in this beautiful country, never knowing anything other than peace and democracy and freedom. And I hope from what I've said here today, it's clear that the handover of Kinsale from British forces to the Irish Provisional Government was not as glorious as it might sound. The Irish didn't march into these strongholds and live happily ever after. In many ways, that happy ever after and the ideals that were fought for 100 years ago are yet to be achieved. We may have a republic, but there is still a border on our little island. We've come a long way, but there's surely a long way to go in ensuring a fair and equal society, dreamed up by our revolutionary ancestors, is achieved. We must take inspiration from them and draw on their courage and forward thinking to continue to strive for better and confront the challenges that we face today, such as climate change, homelessness and discrimination. And I think what's going on in Ukraine now really shows us that independence and freedom is not something to be taken for granted, because it's not easily achieved and it's not easily held on to. I'll leave it there.
So what we're going to do now, we're going to do is part of the reenactment is for that we're thanks to Lord Edward Home and the Enniscorthy Historical Reenactment Society. He has to be there to be here. So we have so what we're going to do is we're going to have any force for it to mark down, take down their Union Jack and then destroy the flagpole, which they did in Constant Barracks. And in fact in Constant Barracks, because the Irish were 2 minutes too late apparently, they tried to save it, but by the time they can come in, and there's a famous picture of them there of the flagpole being crushed out. So we start there, lads. now we're going to have the religious reflection, and it's very much a reconciliation. And we're delighted to have Father Stan and the Reverend Rutherford here today. Just on a personal note, hint to the slight bit of sadness. Most of you in the town would have known Willie Pearce. Willie's two uncles, William and Patrick, they're no relation to the lads in Dublin, but bore the same name. We're very much involved in the War of Independence here. Patrick worked in the fort, and he was passing messages to the Irish, and a lot of people thought if he was ever caught, he would have been killed then straight away, executed and what have you. Died in the Civil War. But Willie was always very proud of him, and he was great for telling people like me about what happened in the town and stuff. Unfortunately, Willie passed away this year, so I'd like to remember Willie Pearce today. Thank you. We're heading into the Civil War, a very bitter part in Irish history, and in my family there's a very interesting story. One of my relatives, Jim Hurley, who was very much involved in the flying column and was at Bale-na-Blah the day that Collins was shot. And after the Civil War, one day he was outside who was no John Shafter Collins. He was Collins' brother, and he was pacing up and down outside the door. And Shafter came out and he said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I'm Jim Hurley, I'm from Clonakilty." He was from Clonakilty. And funny enough, I found out that Collins' father is buried in the same graveyard as my ancestor, so he must have known that as well. But they became lifelong friends, and when they both died in the mid-60s, they're both buried together, almost together in Clonakilty graveyard. So it just shows the recognition. So we have to treat these ceremonies and the 12 months, the better not to forget about that, and remember that we can become better if we work together, and that's the lesson for this country. So now can we please call Reverend Stan and Reverend Rutherford for the prayer service.
Just to let you know that this short reflection is going to be short, and probably the response to that is, thank God. A short reading from the 18th Psalm, a reminder that it is God who is our true fortress. I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my champion. My God in whom I shelter, my shield and sure defender, my strong tower. I shall call to the Lord, whom we praise and give. Then I shall be made safe from all my enemies. The word of the Lord. Father Stan and I are just going to offer a prayer of commemoration and celebration of the events that we are remembering. Heavenly Father, as we commemorate and celebrate the events of 100 years ago and the peaceful handing over of this place from crown forces to those of the Irish Free State, we give thanks for all that was good and true in the lives of those who lived and worked here in times past. We give thanks for its restoration and preservation, and we pray that all who visit here may be guided by your Holy Spirit to learn of all that makes peace and harmony between the people of all nations. This prayer we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Pray.
Thank you very much, Reverend Father, for that. Now can I call on the Minister to give his address?
Vera, greetings the whole Huffing, ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Fathers, Mayor, elected representatives, distinguished guests, you're all very welcome to Charlesford here today, and I'm delighted that Minister for the Office of Public Works, this is an OPW site to represent the government here today on what is an important centenary, the handing over of Charlesford
from Crown Forces to representatives of the provisional government at the time when people at the time might have expected that provisional government mightn't have lasted very long. But as we know now, that government has, in that period of time, represented the fourth longest continuing serving democracy in Europe. Not bad for a group of men and women at the time who were resisted not only from outside, but in some cases from within as well. So, for this small country, in this small place today, this is something worth celebrating. And it is something worth bringing together this community here in Kinsale. And I want to thank the local community who have brought you all together. But I specifically want to thank the Mayor, who during her duty as representative of Cork County in Chicago, browbeat me into making sure that this event happens here today on the OPW site. So, Mayor, thanks very much for making sure that it happens. I can say she represented you very well abroad as well as at home. So this is a hugely significant site, not only in terms of OPW's catalogue of sites, but it's an important site internationally as well, because when this site was first built, it was built in the guise of a Louis XIV site, and it was built by the British for the purposes of maintaining this part of Ireland against invasion. And since then you can almost chart all of Ireland's history out of this location, right to modern times. And you can chart the progress of the town of Kinsale and the hinterlands to this part of West Cork as well. And OPW is very fortunate that we are, not only are we here today to manage this event, but we are custodians, and I want to pay tribute to the men and women who look after it in terms of our guide service, but as well as that, our engineering staff and our heritage staff who have not only restored it since it became a national monument in 1973 for the people who visit it now, but the plans that we have for the future as well. And we want to work with the town of Kinsale and with the hinterland here in West Cork, Cork County Council, Falls Ireland and others, to bring the numbers of people that are coming through the fortification here from the numbers that are currently coming through to rise it even more, to tell the story of this part of Ireland and the history that this part of Ireland has to offer, and the history of pre-independence and post-independence, and the future that this country has to offer as well. And reference was made a while ago to the struggles in other parts of Europe, and we are very fortunate here to celebrate the foundation of our independence. And our independence is something that we all need to be mindful of. And our heritage services within OPW is something that while we look backwards in terms of making sure that we look after our monuments, and OPW has upwards of 800 of them that we look after, our future, and there's a lot of children here today, our future is something that we are very conscious of, and working with the Department of Housing, Heritage and Local Government, we preserve and protect these and present them for future generations, and that's something that I'm very conscious of as Minister for the OPW. So today is about commemorating the past, but it's also about looking forward to the future. And we want to make sure that this place has a future in terms of your community, and your community being at the centre of it. And listening to your community, we have also a number of other sites around the country, not to mention places like the Royal Hospital, the Maynham Jail, Desmond Castle, right up and down the country. And here at the centre of Kinsale, that's the Wild and Nancy Way, we know that this place has an awful lot to offer. And that is why we will be working with you through your elected representatives, through your councillors, through your office members, to make sure that we do more for Charlesford. You heard a while ago about the taking in charge of it and the history of it. So, we want to make sure that that is done into the future. Queen Elizabeth I was one of the first people to have her eye on this place when she fortified it, to make sure that the Spanish wouldn't get their hands in it. So we want to make sure now that when the Spanish come here in the future, and I saw the Spanish flag outside there on the way in, that it isn't to conquer the place, but it is to make sure that they leave their euros here. And we want to make sure that they leave a lot. And the last recorded numbers that we have here are about 73,000 visitors. So we want to grow that. and we know that there's a lot of potential here to grow that into the future, and we can see that over the last 2 years in particular, with the pandemic and with staycationing, that we have seen, particularly with the numbers of people that have been here from Cork County alone, that people are now only beginning to explore places like this, and that realise the value of having a place like Charlesford on their backyard. And with a massive urban centre like Cork City up the road, we can see the benefit of having a place like this. So I'm very privileged that I have the Office of Public Works to be Minister for, but I also know the challenges that I have to restore and invest in places like this. And I'm privileged really when I see the places that we have, the Rock and Casher in Charlesford, the Skelligs, the really iconic places that Ireland is known for internationally. And the challenge for me will be to make sure that we get further investment in this. So before I finish, I just want to thank again the people that are here today representing the OPW, the representatives of Oakley Nahiran, there is only one Oakley Nahiran that are here today, the Defence Forces, and I want to thank them for being here today. I want to thank my own staff in Dublin who have facilitated it through your organising committee, and I want to thank you for turning out today to commemorate those people, young women and men who set out to form a state in 1922. Most of them were only in their 30s, the people who formed the first government, and it was a government that internationally people waited to see how long would it take to fail. 100 years on, Ireland is the fourth longest continuing serving democracy in Europe, and we are a shining light to places like Ukraine. And this week, when the Minister for Foreign Affairs went out to his opposite number in Ukraine, it was to send a message to the people of Ukraine that Ireland fully supports Ukraine's membership of the European Union. And as a small country, as a newly elected member, rather, to the United Nations Security Council, from this small little place in Charlesford, in Kinsale, 100 years later, while we are a small country, we have, I think, a lot to offer in terms of our place in the world. So those men and women that 100 years ago took down that flag and put up our flag, really for this generation that is standing here in front of me, we're handing on a message to be proud of who we are, to be proud of what we are, and to make sure that when we send that message around the world, that message that was handed on to us here 100 years ago, that we handed on to them here today 100 years later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for coming today. And again, thank you to the OPW and yourself for allowing us to use the board today. Before I call on the Mayor for her speech and the oration of the day, I'm always reminded of what Senator Mark Daly said at a commemoration some years ago. He said there was a lot of ordinary people did an extraordinary thing 100 years ago, and some of those people we remember from Kinsale today. Now in Shannon's book she has a full list, but I'm going to call out the people. I think some of their relatives are here today, and I'm just going to call out some of the names of those people who ensured that this country, as the Minister said, were able to run that flag up. Kinsale was a dangerous place to be in. If some of you think of Ukraine today and think of the horrors that were going on there, the same fate faced some of those people in Kinsale if they were caught. They would have been tortured and executed. And they were just ordinary people. And some of those people were, and I just remember there was James and Seamus O'Neill, Shannon's grandmother, Margaret, or great-grandmother, Margaret Cotter, Padraig's granduncle, Seamus Brannock. Seamus Brannock was agitating for Irish independence as far back as 1904 and 1905, when it wasn't very popular to be doing it. Johnny Gimlet, Patsy Hurley, Tig Lynch, Joanne Curran, Patrick and William Pearce, Tommy Mullins, Daniel and Ellen O'Sullivan, and Michael John Farley. Now, as I said, there's a far greater list in Shannon's book, but today we remember those people.
a gweil. Nachwyd y gohwntwg y fe siast an sians yn fwch agus an faringa, masif as opdan ara, thos gohwntwg. Tá sé tá fáilte roid chuig dún tarnas yn ub, con cymora ianab, an hacawal cion tála o fórsaí na bratina céad blian o hyn. Now I'm no stranger to Charles Fort. I'm really pleased to be here today, friends, to come back as Mayor of the county to a place where I had very many happy student summers as a guide here under Evelyn Long and kind of made many, many friends. So it really is a great homecoming for me today and an honour. What I really want to emphasise today, and the point that I really want to emphasise, is the importance of Kinsale in the British Empire, right down through time. Not only in the 19th and 20th century, but right back. And I think that gives some context. And I see my fellow councillor, Kevin Murphy here. Kevin always calls Kinsale the jewel in the crown of County Cork. And the British Empire saw that as such as well. Kinsale received its first charter from King Edward III in 1334. The town began to grow and prosper with the decades with trade and, of course, the beautiful port. As with the rest of Munster, Kinsale changed the fate of the Irish Lords, and by the Elizabethan plantation of Munster, things began to change. The battle, of course, which is commemorated in the town's name, the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, was really a war for Ulster. O'Neill and O'Donnell, with their men, marched down through the country from Tyrone and Tyrconnell and joined forces here with O'Sullivan Bear and with Don Juan Aguila of Spain. The British forces under Lord Mountjoy routed the alliance and ended the Gaelic hegemony, with many of the leaders of the great Gaelic clans, many of whom I see here from Courses and all around, the great Gaelic clans, unfortunately having to flee our country. As an aside, Minister, of course, that the wild geese are commemorated very well in Desmond Castle, and we look forward to Desmond Castle in Kinsale hopefully reopening soon and telling the story of the wine geese, of course, which was such an important part of our history. In the aftermath of the Battle of Kinsale, defensive positions around Ireland were being assessed, and again, jewel in the crown here, Kinsale was assessed here in the estuary, the Bandon estuary, and noted for a fortress. So a fortress was built over at Castle Park, again to keep an eye on ships entering and exiting the estuary. In the 1640s, with religious wars rife across Europe, Kinsale was yet again at the centre of the action, with the death of Charles I. His nephew, stationed here at Kinsale at that time, pretended to the throne of England. However, on the 12th of November in 1649, Kinsale declared for Cromwell, and Prince Rupert made his escape to the continent. Indeed, Oliver Cromwell visited Kinsale in the aftermath of that escape in 1649. So, what I want to really emphasise is that Kinsale has always been important, and it began to grow in strategic importance even from then. By the 1670s, it was considered that the threat from the continent merited another fortress. And if you look back here at the beautiful bastions of Charles Fort, in 1677, Charles Fort was constructed, and in 1681 it was renamed Charles Fort from, of course, Ringcurrent Park. So over those 350 odd years from King Edward on, we've seen hundreds of thousands of pounds spent from the British purse, from the British Empire, invested here in Kinsale, in the bastion of Kinsale. And let us say that those hundreds of thousands of pounds are still welcome from Britain, as we welcome visitors here to Kinsale, warmly welcome visitors here to Kinsale, from Britain and the world around, down through time. But the foundations were set with that investment for Kinsale to be a major military fortress. And that is why today's commemoration is so important. All of that work, all of that money, all of those soldiers, all of the provisions, all of the trade to defend Kinsale, to defend Ireland, to keep it, to mind it, to protect it for the British Empire. And yet, over the next 250 years, and particularly as we move into the early 20th century, we see Republican fervour grow. And as we stand here in the rain, unfortunately, on an Easter Monday, the hope of Easter and the spirit of Easter imbues us as we remember the men and women of 1916. And that part of the story of Ireland is important as we think of the rising in Dublin, which of course did not unfortunately take part around the rest of the country in significant state. However, in the aftermath of the 1916 rising, the execution of the signatories and the internment of so many young volunteers, men just interned without trial in camps, military camps in Britain. This is what lit the flame again in the early 20th century. I do want to name those who were executed in Easter 1916, as we are here at Easter time, and I appreciate that it's raining. However, I do think we should name Padraig Pearse, Tom Clark, Tomas MacDonagh, Joseph Plunkett, Edward Daly, William Pearse, Michael O'Hanrahan, John McBride, Eamon Cant, Michael Mallon, Con Colbert, Sean Houston, Thomas Kent, and Sean McDermott, James Connolly, and Roger Casement. Those men were executed after court-martial, secret court-martial. Only Roger Casement had a public trial. They were executed for their belief in an Irish Republic. This stirred, and their funerals stirred the Republican fervour among the volunteers. Here in County Cork, when some of those interned were released in December of 1916, it really began to get things going. The release of 600 prisoners on the 22nd of December 1916 reinvigorated the public organisation in this locality and made people determined to achieve the future. Historian Diarmaid Kingston in Beleaguered says, the returned prisoners instilled a new sense of pride, a reborn spirit of nationalism in young men and women when they addressed huge crowds in the towns and villages along the windy coastal roads from the harbour of Kinsale to the hinterlands and westward to the fishing port of Kinsale. They had come from the Republican University of Frongach and many other military installations in the UK. For the next 5 years around the country, young Irish men and Irish women drilled, organised, spied, fought, defended, were wounded and were killed for the ideal of Irish freedom. As Mayor, I have had the privilege to attend many of the commemorations where these young men and women, their deaths were commemorated. In Clonbannon, in Dripsey and in Clonmulch and other places. However, I unfortunately missed Crossbarry, which of course is such an important victory here in this locality. But I think of the bravery and the dedication and the belief which spurred them on. All they had were the stories of Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmett in their minds, perhaps the recollected memory of the funeral of the buried O'Donovan Rossa and the great oration which Padraig MacPearse elucidated there. And from his speech, the defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased one half of us and taken the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, that they have provided against everything. But the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree will never be at peace. The suffering and fortitude of the men and women of the Kinsale area is really brought to light in Shannon Ford's excellent book, Don't Forget Me Now. I am so grateful to Shannon in particular for her emphasis on the sacrifice of the women. So often in the history books. For example, the Fitzgerald and Bertha Fisher were all involved in common activities. Hannah here, but she was still involved in carrying this practice and doing other messages. Again, however, the risk in a garrison town of 600 years of standing, to have that bravery, to have that backbone, to have that mission up, is something not to be looked at, and something that we hold here because we're here today. The volunteers put their families, their friends, and their community at risk of dreadful atrocities, reprisals, and it was the Barley, those scenes where British soldiers enter farmyards, enter houses, and create dreadful terror in households. They are based on real accounts. July 1921, a truce came into effect. Michael Collins welcomed the truce, knew how much his military was stretched. Within days of the truce, Eamon de Valera went to London to meet with Prime Minister Lord George. As we know, the Treaty of 1921, which created the Irish Free State, satisfied very least of all the Republicans. The British had not lost a dominion. The Unionists remained part of the UK of the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, and Southern Ireland is now to be called the Irish Free State. Here, along the Bandon Valley, it drove heartbreaking splits to families, friends, and communities. Nevertheless, it was the 1921 treaty which entitled the Irish Free State Army to march here through this walkway into Charlesfort and to raise the tricolour here. The bastion of empire was transferred peacefully from one force to the other. It is indeed an historic day, and I pay tribute to the organisers of today who have reenacted that, particularly for children who may not remember all of what was said, but who remember the drama of our reenactors today. In 1973, this fort was taken over by the Office of Public Works, and it has remained, has been restored, and now is a magnificent tourist attraction. And I pay tribute to the Minister and to the head guide and all of the staff for the work that they are doing around Ireland in our tourist facilities, in our archaeological and architectural heritage sites. As I said at the beginning, we stand here in the spring of 2022 and we commemorate a war while war wages still in Europe. We can identify with our Ukrainian neighbours suffering at the hands of a larger imperial neighbour. The influx of refugees, inflation, and the war itself will create challenges for our citizens, for our local authority, and for our government. I hope that the fortitude, stoicism, and solidarity that the men and women of the 1919 to 22 period showed will be reflected in our solidarity with our Ukrainian brethren, and that we will help them in the spirit of national self-determination, which after all is the most important right of all. Gurman with the
106 years ago, the men of the Connacht Rangers from Kinsale helped to round up the suspect nationalists in Kinsale. They left the fort here and they went west, and they arrested the future Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence McSweeney, who died in hunger strike in 1920. They didn't endear themselves to the nationalists of the area, obviously, who felt betrayed. However, when the Rangers went to India in 1920, they were outraged at what was going on in Ireland. And a group of them led a mutiny by James Daly, and in their ranks was a Bill Coote. Now, Bill was a Dublin man, but he'd married a girl from Kinsale. He'd been a lifelong ranger, he had been a boxing champion, he had served in the trenches with distinction, and he had been in this town. Like many of them, for what he did, he lost his pension, he was stripped of his medals, and he was sent to prison, leaving a young wife in Kinsale with children, with the British regularly raiding their house. But Bill admitted afterwards that he did it for Ireland. And I just would like to remember Bill Coote today. He's another one. But what's interesting about what the Rangers did in India, during that mutiny they ran up the tricolour. Now they ran up the tricolour for two reasons. One, to register the Irish flag, and secondly, in solidarity with the Indian local community who were suffering at the hands of the British. Now, I have always said the first running up of that flag, that our tricolour, has been replicated many times by our defence forces throughout the world, from the Lebanon to the Congo to Cyprus to many, many parts of the world. And today we're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hurley to read the proclamation. And he has been one of those soldiers who has been around the world and has run up the tricolours for community that need support and need that there's somebody to care about them. And I do think our defensive forces, I'm actually looking here today, I see Declan Grenway, former Captain Declan Grenvay, retired. We also have, he's not here today, but Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Gray. Both of them served with distinction on United Nations missions, and I'd like to recognise their both work. But today, can I call on Robert Hurley he's going to do the proclamation.
Public Naheran, the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic to the people of Ireland. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which He receives our old tradition of nationhood. Ireland, through us, summons her children to our flag and strikes for our freedom. Having organised and trained her manhood through her secret revolutionary organisation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and through our open military organisations, the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army. Having patiently perfected her discipline, having resolutely waited for the right moment to reveal itself, she now seizes that moment, and supported by our exiled children in America and by our gallant allies in Europe, but relying in the first on her own strength, she strikes in full confidence of victory. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. The long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and government has not extinguished the right, nor can it ever be extinguished, except by the destruction of the Irish people. In every generation, the Irish people have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty. 6 times during the past 300 years, they have asserted it. Standing on that fundamental right, and again asserting it in arms in the face of the world, we hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state. And we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and of its exaltations among the nations. The Irish Republic is entitled to, and hereby claims, the allegiance of every Irish man and every Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all of its citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and of all its parts, cherishing all the children of the nation equally, and oblivious of the differences carefully fostered, the children of the nation equally, carefully fostered by an alien government, which have divided a minority from the majority in the past, until our arms have brought the opportune moment for the establishment of a permanent national government, representative of the whole people of Ireland, and elected by the suffrages of all her men and women. The provisional government hereby constituted will administer the civil and military affairs of the Republic in trust for the people. We place the cause of the Irish Republic under the protection of the Most High God, whose blessing we invoke upon our arms, and we pray that no one who serves that cause will dishonour it by cowardice, inhumanity, or rapine. In this supreme hour, the Irish nation must, by its valour and discipline, and by its readiness of its children to sacrifice themselves for the common good, prove itself worthy of the august destiny to which it is called. Signed on behalf of the Provisional Government, Thomas J. Clark, Sean McDermott, P.H. Pearce, James Connolly, Thomas McDonough, Eamon Kent, Joseph Plunkett.